Chapter 21. The Storm of the Dead. The Drakwald sky split apart. The artifact screamed. A pulse of sickly green fire erupted from its cursed core, sending shockwaves of unnatural energy tearing through the ancient forest. Trees shuddered and cracked, their bark peeling away in blackened strips, their roots wrenching themselves free from the cursed earth as the very land recoiled in agony. The Warherd of Khorgar Bloodhorn fell to their knees, their hooves digging into the trembling dirt, their minds clawed open by the sheer force of what had been unleashed. The air grew thick, suffocating, filled with a stench of burnt souls and ancient wrath. And then the dead answered the call. The spectral legion rises. It began as whispers, low, gnawing voices that slithered through the trees, wrapping around the beastmen like chains of cold dread. Then the whispers grew, rising to an unholy chorus of howls, 1,000 agonized screams woven together as if the very wind had been torn from the lungs of the long dead. And then, from the darkness between the trees, from the cracked bones of the Drakwald itself, they came. Spectral warriors clad in blackened armor, their hollow eye sockets burning with green hellfire, their blades dripping with the essence of something that should not exist. They were no longer individuals. They were one will, one hunger, one relentless storm of hate. They moved as mist, then hardened into flesh, their ancient banners whipping in the unnatural wind, their shattered armor groaning as they took form once more. Some still bore the sigils of forgotten kingdoms, their emblems faded with age and sorrow. Others carried shattered shields, rusted axes, broken swords, remnants of wars long lost to time. But they had not forgotten. They had never left. They had simply waited. And now the seal was broken. Now they were free. A Warherd torn asunder. The first to die was an Ungor, his small, twisted form barely able to lift his spear before a spectral halberd cleaved through him, not slicing his flesh, but something deeper. His body crumpled, his eyes rolling back, his fur turning gray and brittle, as if time had devoured him in a single heartbeat. He did not even scream. The second to fall was a Bestigor, roaring in blind fury, swinging his massive axe at the nearest wraith. His blade passed through the air, meeting no resistance, as if he had swung at mist. Then the wraith moved. Its blade flickered, shifting like smoke, before solidifying, and in a single, silent stroke, it severed the Bestigor's head from his shoulders. No spray of blood, no sound of flesh splitting. Only silence as the Bestigor's body crumbled into dust, his soul ripped from existence. Then the slaughter truly began. The Warherd turned on itself, their panic driving them to madness, their weapons slashing at the air, hitting nothing, their war cries drowned out by the endless screams of the dead. Minotaurs bellowed in rage, their massive fists swinging through the ghosts, but they might as well have been fighting the wind. A hulking minotaur managed to grasp a spectral warrior in its massive claws, lifting the wraith high into the air, but the warrior did not struggle. Instead, its green fire eyes locked onto the beast, its helmet tilting slightly, almost mocking. Then, without a single motion, the minotaur's fingers blackened, its flesh withering, its muscles collapsing in on themselves. The creature screamed, its arms curling inward, its ribs breaking like dry twigs, as its very essence was drained from its body. Within moments it was nothing but a husk, a crumbling pile of blackened bones. And still the spectral warriors marched forward. Khorgar's defiance. Khorgar Bloodhorn stood amidst the storm of death, his clawed fists clenched, his teeth bared, his burning green eyes locked onto the unnatural tide of the dead. The artifact pulsed within his chest, its power woven into his flesh, but he could feel it now more than ever. This was not a gift. this was a curse. His Warherd was being torn apart, their blood and souls devoured, and yet the artifact only grew stronger. It was feeding. He threw back his head and roared, his voice shaking the earth, his massive cleaver lifted high, its edge crackling with unholy energy. I am Bloodhorn, I am war, I am the end. His challenge rang through the battlefield, a defiance against the impossible. A spectral knight stepped forward, its form shifting, flickering, its eyes locked onto Khorgar. Khorgar judged. His cleaver swung down, a stroke meant to shatter mountains, to split the heavens in half. The spectral knight caught it mid-air, its gauntlet closing around the blade, its grip solid as death itself. Khorgar's eyes widened in rage. The knight simply tilted its hollow helm. Then it threw him back. Khorgar crashed against the earth, the impact shattering the bones of his fallen warriors beneath him, his chest heaving, his muscles screaming. He staggered to his feet, snarling, but deep inside, for the first time since claiming the artifact, he felt something he had never felt before. Doubt, because he now understood the truth. The spectral warriors had never been his to command. They had never been his army. They had simply been waiting for him to bring them back. And now, they no longer needed him. The artifact pulsed again, this time not with hunger, but with something far worse. Satisfaction. Khorgar's rage twisted into realization. He had not become a god of war. He had become a key, and the lock had finally been broken. The screaming night never ends. The storm of the dead raged on, consuming everything, tearing apart the Warherd, their screams lost in the unholy symphony of slaughter. Some tried to flee. They were cut down without mercy. Some begged for their lives. The dead did not listen. And at the heart of the storm, Khorgar stood alone, his burning green eyes flickering, his mind drowning in the weight of what had been done. For the first time, he wondered if this had never been his war at all, and that perhaps he had only been the first to die. Chapter 22. The Doom of the Bray Shaman. The storm of the dead raged on, an unrelenting tide of phantasmal warriors tearing through what remained of Khorgar Bloodhorn's Warherd. The screams of the dying beastmen, those who had once believed themselves the true masters of the Drakwald, were now mere whispers beneath the howls of forgotten revenants, their voices rising like a funeral dirge over the battlefield. And at the eye of this nightmare, Malgar Blacktongue watched, his one remaining eye wide, his breath heavy, as the truth finally consumed him whole. The artifact was no gift of the dark gods. It was no trophy of chaos, no blessing from the Horn One. It was a curse upon the world, and Malgar had been a fool to ever believe he could control it. He turned toward Khorgar, his warlord. No, his beast lord no longer, for what stood before him was something else entirely. Khorgar Bloodhorn was changing, his towering form wreathed in green fire, his horns elongated into jagged blackened spires, his flesh pulsing with raw wyrdstone energy. His eyes, once bestial, once filled with the simple rage of a warlord, were now pits of burning emerald fire, his body an unnatural fusion of beastman and something that should never have walked the mortal world. And yet, Malgar could see it was not his warlord who commanded this power. It was the power commanding him. The artifact had taken root within Khorgar's very soul, had entwined itself around his essence, and now it fed upon him, warping him into a creature of nightmare, reshaping him into something that was never meant to exist. Malgar clenched his twisted staff, his mind racing, calculating, grasping for a way to undo this madness. And then, for the first time in his wretched life, he made a decision not for his own gain, but for the sake of the Warherd. He would break the artifact's hold over Khorgar, even if it killed him. The ritual of desperation. Malgar raised his staff high, his clawed fingers curling into the air, the ancient glyphs etched into the gnarled wood pulsing with sickly, unnatural light. I call upon the Dark Ones, the true powers of ruin. I demand the right to speak, to undo what has been done. The earth trembled beneath him, but the artifact did not react as he expected. No booming laughter from the gods of chaos, no gifts of mutation, no whispers of unseen deities granting him their favor. Instead, the screams of the spectral warriors grew louder. The shadows around him deepened, and the sky itself seemed to close in, as though the world was being folded inward upon itself. Khorgar snarled, his green flame eyes snapping toward Malgar, his chest rising and falling like a beast barely held in its cage. "You dare?" His voice was not his own anymore. It was layered, thick with something else, something that had been waiting beneath reality for far too long. Malgar did not flinch, though his hands trembled. "You are being consumed, Bloodhorn. This is no gift. This is your undoing." Khorgar's clawed fingers flexed, his muscles tightening, but Malgar pushed forward, his voice rising into a crescendo of raw magic. "I break this bond. I sunder this foul pact. By fang and claw, by blood and darkness, I cast this power from you. I defy the—" He never finished. The doom of Malgar Blacktongue. The artifact pulsed once, and the spectral legion turned upon him. From the swirling void, from the maelstrom of wraiths and forgotten kings, they came, not to attack the Warherd, not to consume more of the living, but to punish the heretic who had dared to resist. Malgar barely had time to raise his staff in defense before the first phantom knight was upon him, its sword flashing in an arc of emerald flame. His staff split in half, the ancient wood crumbling to dust, the dark runes that had protected him for decades turning to ash in a single heartbeat. "No!" Malgar shrieked, stumbling backward, his milky eye wide with terror, his twisted robes whipping in the spectral storm. The wraiths did not care. The second blade fell, slicing into his shoulder, but it did not cut flesh. It carved into his soul, burning from the inside out, his veins turning black, his body convulsing as his very essence was being torn apart. His mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out, only a horrid, wheezing breath, as though his very lungs had withered in an instant. More spectral warriors descended upon him, each taking their turn, their weapons plunging into his body, into his being, not killing him but breaking him, unmaking him piece by piece. His skin shriveled, his bones twisted, his flesh sloughed away in blackened chunks, until he was nothing but a withering husk, held together only by the last shreds of his will. Khorgar watched, his burning green eyes emotionless, as though he had already left behind the world of mortal concerns. Malgar reached out one last time, his clawed fingers trembling, reaching toward the warlord he had once guided, once manipulated, once thought he could control. But there was no saving him. There was no undoing what had been done. His lips parted, one final gasping breath escaping, and then the wraiths took the last of him. His body collapsed into dust, his robes fluttering empty in the howling wind, his soul devoured by the very thing he had once sought to wield. The artifact pulsed one last time, and then there was silence. The Warherd watches. The remaining beastmen stared in horror, their bloodied weapons lowered, their bestial instincts screaming at them to flee, to run from the nightmare that had become their warlord. Khorgar stood alone, his shadow long in the cursed light, his massive frame hunched, his claws twitching, his breath slow and controlled. He turned his gaze to the warband, and they shrank beneath his stare, their eyes avoiding the burning pits of green fire that had once been their warlord's gaze. He was no longer just Khorgar Bloodhorn. He was something else, now, something worse. And deep in the cursed winds of the Drakwald, the whispers of the artifact laughed. Because Malgar had been right. This was not a gift. This was a throne, and Khorgar Bloodhorn had already taken his seat. Chapter 23. The Final Ritual. The Drakwald burned, not with fire and ruin, but with unholy green flame that twisted reality itself. The Warherd, what little remained of it, knelt in the clearing of slaughter, their heads bowed, their bestial faces twisted in fear and reverence. Before them, Khorgar Bloodhorn stood, his massive form shrouded in eldritch fire, his horns now blackened spires, curving like the crown of a dark god, his claws lengthened, jagged, dripping with the raw essence of the artifact. He was no longer just a beastman warlord. He was something else now, something that should not be. The artifact pulsed violently, its power no longer bound to mere stone, but now woven into Khorgar's very being. The relic had no need for a wielder anymore. It had found its vessel, the throne of the Forsaken. The clearing had been transformed into a shrine of horrors, the very air crackling with madness, the earth beneath their hooves split open, veins of wyrdstone running like rivers of molten corruption. At the center of it all, the artifact rested upon a throne of bones, the remains of men, beastmen, and things beyond understanding, fused together in a ghastly display of raw entropy. Khorgar ascended the steps, his breath coming in slow, measured bursts, his burning green eyes locked upon the relic, his body trembling not with hesitation, but with anticipation. He could feel it now. The power, the hunger, the promise. He would not be another mortal warlord. He would not be another footnote in the endless wars of beast and man. He would ascend. He would become a god, and nothing would stop him. The Warherd watches in terror. The few remaining bestikers and minotaurs stood motionless, their massive frames hunched, their bestial minds screaming for them to run, to turn and flee into the depths of the forest. But they could not move. They were ensnared. Not by chains, not by fear alone, but by the pull of the artifact itself, its whispers now a howling storm, wrapping around them like serpents, forcing them to witness the birth of something unnatural. "Bloodhorn," one of them rasped, his voice a mixture of awe and horror. What are you?" Khorgar did not turn to them, did not acknowledge them. He had no need for them anymore. They were prey, and he was so much more. The ritual begins. Khorgar lifted his clawed hands, and the artifact pulsed in response, its veins of wyrdstone running up his arms, burrowing into his flesh like living roots, digging into his muscles, his bones, his very essence. He did not scream. He welcomed it. The sky split apart, clouds twisting into a vortex of green fire, the stars vanishing, swallowed by the abyss that had been waiting for this moment. The ground beneath him cracked and split, as though the world itself was rejecting his existence, the very fabric of reality warping under the weight of the transformation. Then came the voices. Not the whispers of the artifact, not the screeches of lesser demons, but something older, deeper, beyond the knowledge of gods and mortals alike. You are the gate. You are the key. You are the unmaking. Khorgar's muscles flexed, his new form rippling with unnatural energy, his hooves lifting from the ground, suspended in the air, held by the sheer will of the thing that was now taking shape within him. His body twisted, his ribcage expanding, his jagged teeth elongating into rows of fangs, his horns now burning like twin pillars of green fire, his bones snapping and reforming into something beyond mortal comprehension. He was shedding his flesh. He was becoming something greater, something infinite. And still the Warherd watched, frozen in their place of worship and terror, as their warlord became a god before their very eyes. The blood price of ascension. But then something went wrong. The artifact pulsed wildly, its energy crackling erratically, the green fire that had once embraced him now licking at his flesh with malicious intent. His ascension slowed. His body shuddered violently, his clawed hands curling inward, his breath hitching. Something was fighting him. Something was resisting. For the first time, Khorgar's burning gaze flickered, uncertainty flashing across his mutated face. He had been so certain, so sure that he was in control. But the artifact, the thing that had whispered, the thing that had lured him with promises of godhood, it was not giving him power. It was consuming him. It had always been feeding, waiting for the perfect vessel, waiting for a warlord foolish enough to think he could wield it. And now it would take him entirely. A low, guttural laugh slithered through his mind, a mockery of his arrogance, a final confirmation of his doom. Did you truly think you were meant to rule? You were never meant to be a god. You were meant to be an offering. Khorgar screamed, his roar of rage and defiance turning to agony as his body began to unravel, his flesh splitting, his essence being pulled inward, spiraling toward the artifact like a black hole, devouring all that surrounded it. The Warherd recoiled, watching their lord of war be torn apart, his massive form writhing, his body collapsing in on itself, as his very soul was funneled into the cursed relic. "No!" Khorgar bellowed, his voice cracking, his form flickering between worlds, between flesh and something beyond understanding. His claws grasped at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. There was only the abyss. The very power he had sought to control was now dragging him down into oblivion, consuming his being, absorbing his strength, his will, his rage, his hatred, until there was nothing left but a burning shadow. And then, with a final earth-shaking roar of defiance, Khorgar Bloodhorn was gone. The artifact pulsed one last time, its green light blinding, then dimmed, its hunger sated at last. The Warherd fell to their knees, some in awe, some in horror, but all knowing the truth. Their warlord was no more, and something else had taken his place, something that should never have been allowed to wake. And in the depths of the Drakwald, as the whispers of the artifact faded into silence, a new voice rose in their place. A voice not of mortal flesh, but of something far, far worse. Chapter 24. The Siege of Blackfang Rock. The Drakwald howled with war. The sky churned, thick with storm clouds laced in unnatural green fire, casting eerie shadows over the ancient fortress of Blackfang Rock. It stood like a rotting fang, a mass of broken towers and jagged stone, its walls marked with crude carvings of ruinous symbols, its battlements swarming with beastmen, their bestial roars mixing with the whispers of the dead. At its summit, where the winds of dark magic howled the loudest, something new had taken form. Something wrong. Something not of this world. The artifact pulsed, its energy warping the air itself, and in its wake, Blackfang Rock was no longer just a fortress. It was a wound upon reality, and Reinhard von Drexler had come to seal it shut. The warhorns sound. From the valley below, the great army of Middenland gathered in formation, their banners flapping against the cold wind, their weapons gleaming under the tainted light. Reinhard sat astride his warhorse, his black coat whipping in the wind, his silver-forged longsword drawn, its blade etched with runes of purity, its steel made to cut through both flesh and corruption alike. Beside him, Grandmaster Wolfram von Hellborg of the Knights of the White Wolf lowered his warhammer, his battle-scarred face twisted into a grim snarl. "We bring fire and steel to this place, von Drexler," he growled. "Not a single beast shall leave this mountain alive." Reinhardt nodded, "Nor the thing that commands them." With a single motion he raised his blade high, and the order was given. The war horns of Middenland blared, the drums of battle thundered, and with an earth-shaking roar, the attack began. The battle begins. The first wave of the Middenland assault crashed against the fortress gates, a tide of steel and fury, their greatswords hacking into the front ranks of the defending Warherd. The beastmen bellowed in defiance, their massive axes cleaving through men, their clawed hands ripping through flesh, their horns goring through plate and chainmail alike. The Knights of the White Wolf charged in thunderous unison, their warhammers smashing into the bestial ranks, crushing skulls, snapping spines, their massive destriers trampling the fallen beneath them. Steel met bone, gunfire ripped through the air, and the valley was consumed by slaughter. Atop the battlements, arrows and jagged spears rained down, fired from crude wooden towers, their tips blackened with poison and filth. A mercenary captain screamed as a spear struck him in the throat, his blood gushing over the rocky ground. A Templar of Sigmar, his tabard still drenched in the gore of Sylvania, raised his hammer and bellowed a prayer, just as a hulking minotaur brought an iron-studded club crashing down upon his head, splattering his skull like rotten fruit. The assault was brutal, but the beastmen were faltering. And then the artifact pulsed, and the true horror began. The summoned horrors. The air shuddered. The storm swelled, and from the depths of the fortress, the dead rose. From the cracked earth, from the shattered ruins, from the very stones of Blackfang Rock itself, the spectral warriors returned. They were no longer bound to Khorgar Bloodhorn. They were no longer bound to anything. They hungered, and they would feed. The first to fall was a knight, his warhorse suddenly rearing in terror, its eyes rolling back in fear as something unseen wrapped around its legs. The knight barely had time to cry out before an unseen blade tore him from the saddle, his body convulsing, his soul ripped free in a wail of agony, his flesh collapsing into dust. The Middenland greatswords turned, only to see an entire wave of spectral warriors emerging from the shadows, their hollowed helms burning with green fire, their blackened weapons dripping with the essence of pure oblivion. A sergeant swung his greatsword, his strike aimed at the nearest wraith, but his blade passed through it as if cutting through mist. Then the wraith moved, its blade solidifying for a brief instant, enough to cleave the man in half, his torso splitting apart, his organs evaporating into nothingness before they could even hit the ground. The mercenaries panicked, their rifles flashing in the dark, their shots finding purchase in flesh but not against the dead. The spectral legion carved through them, their phantasmal weapons striking with impossible speed, their wounds leaving behind nothing but hollow husks, drained of all life. It was a massacre. And from the summit of the fortress, the thing that had once been Khorgar Bloodhorn watched. The beast thing upon the throne. At the highest tower of Blackfang Rock, a twisted figure loomed, its massive frame still wrapped in the last remnants of its former self, but now fully entwined with the artifact's corruption. Khorgar was no longer a beastman warlord. His horns had grown into jagged blackened spires, his body pulsed with veins of green wyrdstone, his claws dripping with raw energy. His eyes no longer burned with mere hatred, they were abyssal voids, swirling with a power not of chaos, not of gods, but of something beyond either. He had become something else, something that should not exist. He raised one massive claw, and the spectral warriors turned toward him, their soulless eyes locked onto their new master. Reinhardt spotted him through the madness, his own green eyes narrowing, his fist clenching around the grip of his sword. This was what he had come for. This was the true enemy. He turned to Grandmaster Hellboard, his voice booming over the chaos. "We cut the head from the beast. We stormed the fortress and put that thing down." The Grandmaster grinned, his weathered face stained with the blood of fallen beastmen, and he kicked his warhorse forward. Then let's carve our way through hell." The knights rallied, the Middenland soldiers tightened formation, and Reinhardt led the charge, their weapons raised high, their war cries rising against the unnatural howls of the dead. They would break through the fortress. They would cut down whatever horror had been born atop Blackfang Rock. And they would end Khorgar Bloodhorn once and for all. Or they would die trying. The storm raged. The fortress trembled. And the final battle began. Chapter 25. The Last Charge of the Templars. The storm raged on, a swirling vortex of green flame and howling souls, casting an unholy glow over Blackfang Rock. What had once been a fortress of beastmen, a monument to ruin and savagery, had become a cursed wound upon reality itself, twisting and pulsing with the artifact's corrupting essence. And atop the highest peak of the fortress, upon a throne of shattered bones and blackened stone, stood Khorgar Bloodhorn, or what remained of him. He was no longer a mere warlord, no longer a beast of flesh and hate. He had transcended. His form had swollen, his blackened horns extending like jagged spires, his once brutal frame now elongated, monstrous, his muscles infused with pulsating wyrdstone, his claws extending into curved talons dripping with raw entropy. His eyes, if they could still be called eyes, were now abyssal voids, burning with spectral green fire, voids that hungered for reality itself. His voice was no longer a mere roar. It was a sound beyond words, beyond mortal tongues, a wail of something that should never have been given form. And yet, despite his apotheosis, despite the nightmare of his ascension, the Knights of the White Wolf did not waver. They had faced undead horrors, demons of the north, and green-skin hordes that would drown a city in blood. Now they would face this, and they would cut it down. The thunder of hooves. Grand Master Wolfram von Hellborg rode at the head of his knights, his mane of gray hair streaked with blood, his warhammer resting across his saddle, its runes glowing faintly under the cursed light. Behind him, 100 Knights of the White Wolf rode in unison, their destriers massive, clad in thick armor, their hooves pounding against the stone like the drums of Sigmar's final war. These were not knights of chivalry. They were warriors of the north, forged in the cruel winters of Middenland, trained in brutality, in war without mercy, in battle without fear. They rode for vengeance. They rode for honor. And if need be, they would ride into the abyss itself to slay this monster. Wolfram turned to his men, raising his hammer high, his voice booming over the storm. "We are the Fangs of the Wolf." The knights roared in answer, their war horses snorting, their armored fists tightening around their weapons. "We have come to cleanse this place." Another roar, their battle cries rising above the wails of the dead. "For Midland Land, for Sigmar, for the Wolf God." The order was given, and the last charge of the Templars began. Through the horde, the first wave of spectral warriors met them head-on, their blackened armor shifting like mist, their weapons wreathed in unnatural flame. The first knight fell, his body imploding as a spectral halberd ripped his soul free, his warhorse collapsing in agony. The second was thrown from his saddle, his chest torn open, his lifeblood vanishing into nothingness before it even touched the ground. But the rest did not slow. They hit the spectral horde like an avalanche, their warhammers smashing into phantasmal forms, shattering helms, breaking ethereal bones, sending wraiths shrieking into the night. One knight rode straight through a wraith, his massive warhammer swinging in a brutal arc, the spectre crumbling into nothingness before it could strike him down. Another crushed a skeletal revenant beneath his horse's hooves, his warhammer caving in the thing's skull, its body collapsing into dust before the wind could carry it away. The battle was a storm of death and fury, the knights riding as one, their hammers falling in perfect rhythm, each blow met with the screams of the cursed, each strike sending shattered ghosts howling into the abyss. But the legion was endless. For every wraith that fell, another rose to take its place. And at the top of Blackfang Rock, Khorgar watched, waiting. Then, with a single motion, he raised his clawed hand, and the artifact pulsed once more. And the true nightmare began. Confronting the beast god. The earth cracked beneath them, the air splitting with a deafening roar, and the fortress itself began to warp, as if reality was being torn apart by the sheer weight of Khorgar's presence. The last of the knights breached the summit, their war horses kicking up dust, their weapons slick with spectral blood. Wolfram von Hellborg leapt from his saddle, his hammer held high, his battle-worn face set in grim determination. He locked eyes with Khorgar, this thing that had once been a warlord, now a monstrosity of raw magic and unfathomable power. Khorgar's voice rolled across the battlefield, thick with the sound of 1,000 voices speaking as one. "You cannot stop this." Wolfram spat onto the cursed stone, tightening his grip on his hammer. "Then we'll send you back to whatever pit you crawled from." He charged. The Knights of the White Wolf followed, their battle cries shaking the heavens, their hammers raised high, their faith unbreakable. Khorgar roared, his massive form shifting, his clawed hands crackling with raw, wyrdstone energy, and with a single swing he tore the first knight apart, his body splitting into shreds of fire and flesh. Wolfram's hammer struck home, smashing into Khorgar's chest, sending a shockwave of holy light ripping through the monster's form. But Khorgar did not fall. He laughed, his body splitting open, revealing a core of writhing energy, a form that was no longer bound to this world. And then the artifact pulsed again, and Wolfram realized the truth too late. They were not fighting a warlord. They were not fighting a beast. They were fighting a god. The battle for Blackfang Rock was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 26. The artifact's true power. The fortress of Blackfang Rock trembled, its ancient stone splintering beneath the weight of something unnatural. The very air vibrated, thick with an energy that screeched like a dying world, its presence twisting reality into something half there, half not. At the summit, amidst the carnage of the Knights of the White Wolf, Khorgar Bloodhorn stood, his form no longer a beast-man, no longer even a mortal thing. His massive frame pulsed with weird stone veins, his horns jagged and obsidian, his flesh stretched and shifting, a beast god trapped between existence and oblivion. And in his chest, where his heart had once beat with the savage rage of Goros, of the Horned Ones, of all that was brutality given form, there was now only the artifact, pulsing, straining, breaking. It was not meant for this. It had been a lock, a prison, a thing of binding, not a weapon, not a throne. And now, under the weight of Khorgar's impossible transformation, it began to crack. And the world began to die. The first fracture. The first sign was the silence. The wraiths. Those spectral warriors bound to the artifact's hunger. The endless tide of dead and damned that had haunted the warband and the Middenland host alike, staggered as if they were suddenly untethered from the force that had willed them into being. Their burning green eyes flickered, their weapons wavered, and for a brief, impossible moment, their shapes wavered like reflections in water. Then one of them dissolved mid-strike, its sword dropping into empty air, its form torn apart by something unseen. Another lurched backward, its legs twisting in unnatural ways, its helmet peeling away like a rotted fruit, revealing a face that was not flesh, not bone, but a hollow void where something had been stolen away. And then the real nightmare began. The artifact cracked. A sound ripped through the battlefield, not a shattering of stone, not a howl of demons, but the tearing of something more essential, as though the very idea of existence had been wounded beyond repair. And from that wound, a tide of pure entropy spilled forth. Not fire, not chaos, not even undeath, something worse, the shadow unmaking. The first to be taken was a Middenland soldier, his blade locked in battle with a dying Bestiger, their weapons raised, their bodies slick with the filth of war. Then he was gone. Not killed, not ripped apart, but reduced to a hollowed shape, a shadow of his own form, standing motionless for a brief, agonizing moment before his outline simply bled into the air, leaving nothing behind. The Bestiger turned, only to meet the same fate, his flesh turning to dust, his body stretching, thinning, unraveling like a tapestry unweaving itself. More followed. Templars of Sigmar, their hymns frozen on their lips, their hammers raised against a foe that no longer existed, before they, too, became nothing. A minotaur bellowed in blind fury, swinging its massive club at a spectral knight, but the entropy caught them both, their forms collapsing inward, their screams merging into a single, haunting sound that echoed across the ruins. The living and the dead fell alike, their bodies flickering, twisting, unraveling into shapes that were not meant to exist, then vanishing entirely. The sky bled black, the ground wept dust, and at the center of it all, Khorgar Bloodhorn stood, his massive form still burning with green fire, but his body shuddering, his clawed hands clutching at the artifact buried within his chest. For the first time since his transformation, something alien, something that should not have belonged within him, crossed his burning abyssal eyes. The artifact was taking him, too. It had never been meant to be wielded. And now it was devouring the god it had created. The fall of Blackfang Rock. Reinhard von Drexler, bloodied, battered, and barely clinging to consciousness, stumbled through the ruins of the battlefield, his boots crunching over hollow remains, his pistol shaking in his grip. His men were gone. The Knights of the White Wolf, the Templars of Sigmar, the mercenaries, the warband, the horrors. All of them were being unmade. He turned, his eyes locking onto Khorgar, who now towered above the ruins, his hulking form flickering, his horns splitting into countless fractals of writhing void, his voice a scream of rage and agony as he fought against the thing that had once promised him godhood. The artifact pulsed again, its cracks widening, its form no longer a relic, no longer an object, but a gaping wound in reality itself. Reinhard knew what had to be done. His hands clenched around his sword, its runed steel barely holding back the corruption that clawed at the world, and he charged. The last strike. Khorgar turned, his burning eyes locking onto the lone knight, his jaws parting in a monstrous roar, his massive claws rising to crush the fool who dared to defy him. But Reinhard was faster. With a final, desperate cry, he drove his sword forward, its silvered tip plunging into Khorgar's cursed heart, piercing the artifact buried within his chest. For one horrific moment, nothing happened. Then, the world shattered. A final pulse of entropy exploded outward, consuming everything in its wake, swallowing beastman, knight, revenant, stone, and sky alike, until only a silent void remained. And Blackfang Rock, the fortress of ruin, the temple of slaughter, the unholy throne of a false god, ceased to exist. Aftermath. When the storm passed, when the howling winds of the void were silenced, when the whispers of the dead had faded into the echoes of nothingness, only a scarred wasteland remained. The trees were gone. The fortress was gone. And of the warriors who had fought, only a handful still drew breath, their minds shattered, their bodies frail. Reinhard lay on the ashen ground, his armor cracked, his sword broken, his body trembling from the sheer weight of what had been undone. The artifact was gone. Khorgar Bloodhorn was gone, and the world had barely survived. As the first rays of dawn crested over the ruined battlefield, Reinhardt took a shuddering breath, his eyes lifting to the empty sky. There was no triumph here, only the knowledge that something far worse had almost broken free, and that next time the world might not be so lucky. Chapter 27. The Death of Bloodhorn. The storm of entropy had broken. The artifact lay in shattered ruin, its power no longer bound to reality, its final pulse tearing apart both the living and the dead, leaving behind only ashes and echoes. But Khorgar Bloodhorn still stood. Barely. The monstrous thing that had once been a beastman warlord staggered across the battlefield, his massive frame now twisted beyond all recognition, his horns cracked and blackened, his burning green eyes flickering, his veins pulsing with dying wyrdstone light. His body was breaking apart, not from wounds, not from steel, but from the sheer weight of the power that had used him. He had wanted to be a god. Instead, he was dying as something less than a beast. And standing in his path, sword raised, blood dripping from his broken armor, Reinhardt von Drexler waited. The last duel of the war was about to begin. For the last charge. The battlefield was a nightmare of ruin, littered with the corpses of knights and warherd alike, their bodies frozen in twisted agony, their souls long since burned away by the artifact's final death throes. The few survivors, Middenland soldiers, wounded Templars, scattered mercenaries, stood motionless, watching with wide, hollow eyes, too broken to fight, too afraid. Only Reinhardt still moved. He dragged his ruined sword through the dirt, his legs shaking, his lungs raw from the screams of 1,000 dying men, but still, he stood. Still, he would finish this. Khorgar's massive hooves crushed the remains of his fallen warherd, his mouth twisted into something between a snarl and a grimace, his clawed hands twitching, as if his body no longer knew what to do without the artifact's will guiding it. He locked eyes with Reinhardt, his burning green gaze hollow, his rage all but gone. For the first time, Khorgar Bloodhorn looked afraid. Reinhardt spat blood onto the blackened ground, lifted his broken sword, and whispered, "You fall today, beast." Khorgar roared, and they charged. Steel against monstrosity. The impact shook the earth as Reinhardt threw himself forward, his blade a silver blur, his body screaming in protest from wounds that should have already killed him. Khorgar swung a massive claw, his monstrous strength still more than enough to tear a man apart, but Reinhardt ducked low, rolling beneath the strike, his sword flashing up in a savage arc. The blade found flesh. It ripped across Khorgar's ribs, blackened blood spurting into the air, the wound steaming, burning with the last remnants of wyrdstone corruption. Khorgar howled, lashing out with blind fury, his massive fist catching Reinhardt across the chest. The witch hunter was thrown back, his body smashing against the corpse of a fallen minotaur, his breath ripped from his lungs. Pain exploded through his ribs, but Reinhardt forced himself to rise, gritting his teeth through the agony, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his blade once more. Khorgar staggered, his breathing heavy, the corruption in his flesh eating him from the inside out. But still, he would not fall. The war had been fought. The artifact had been shattered. But until the Beast Lord was dead, there was no victory. Reinhardt wiped blood from his lips and moved again. The beheading of the Beast Lord. Khorgar charged once more, his massive claws swiping in a last, desperate attempt to crush the life from the man who had defied him. But Reinhardt was faster. He sidestepped, ducking beneath one final, wild strike, his sword swinging high, both hands gripping the hilt as he put the last of his strength into one final blow. The blade met Khorgar's neck. Steel bit into flesh, cutting through thick muscle, through cursed bone, severing the beast's head in a single brutal strike. For a brief, impossible moment, Khorgar remained standing, his body twitching, his green flame eyes wide in shock. Then, his head toppled from his shoulders, rolling across the blackened earth, the green fire within his eyes flickering, sputtering, then vanishing into darkness. His massive body collapsed, hitting the ground with the sound of a falling mountain, dust and ash billowing into the air. And with that, Khorgar Bloodhorn, warlord of the Drakwald, champion of the dead, pretender to godhood, was no more. The battlefield collapses. Silence fell. For the first time since the war began, since the first village burned, since the first blood was spilled, the world was still. The few survivors, knights, mercenaries, soldiers, looked to Reinhardt, watching him stand over the beast's corpse, his blade dripping with blackened blood, his body shaking from exhaustion. He swayed, but he did not fall. Instead, he turned, lifting Khorgar's severed head, its horns still burning with dying embers, and raised it high for all to see. A ripple of sound moved through the battlefield, a whisper, then a roar of victory. The Knights of the White Wolf, the last of the Templars, the scattered remnants of Middenland's host, they raised their weapons, their shouts of triumph shaking the valley, their voices a hymn of blood and vengeance. The war was over. The monster was dead. And though they stood upon a graveyard, though the Drakwald would never forget what had happened here, they had survived. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The final breath of the cursed warlord. But as Reinhardt stood over Khorgar's corpse, his breath shaking, his hands trembling, he saw it. One final flicker. One last whisper of wyrdstone light pulsing within the ripped flesh of Khorgar's ruined chest, the last remnants of the artifact's dying power. And for a single, horrifying moment, Reinhardt heard it. A whisper, faint and laughing, slithering through his mind. Not the end, not yet. His blood ran cold. But then the light vanished. The artifact was gone. Khorgar was dead. And the battlefield belonged to the living once more. Reinhardt exhaled slowly, wiping his bloodied blade against the beast's hide before turning to his men. Burn this place. And as the flames rose into the cursed sky, consuming Blackfang Rock, consuming the bodies of the damned, consuming all that remained of the warlord's legacy, Reinhardt turned away, because something deep inside him whispered that the true war was not yet finished, and that some evils do not stay buried forever. Chapter 28. The Vanishing of the Guardians. The blackened sky above Blackfang Rock still churned, though its unnatural green flames had begun to fade into the void. The battlefield was a ruin of corpses and shattered steel, the last remnants of warriors, both mortal and unnatural, littering the ashen ground. But despite the silence that had fallen after Khorgar Bloodhorn's execution, one thing remained. The spectral legion still stood. They did not move. They did not strike. They simply watched, their hollowed helms flickering with green fire, their blackened blades still slick with the blood of the fallen. They had not retreated when the Beast Lord fell. They had not faded when the artifact was shattered. They simply waited. And then the ground began to shake. The war was not over yet. The call back to the abyss. Reinhardt von Drexler, still clutching his bloodied sword, turned his gaze upon the phantasmal warriors, his breath ragged, exhausted, his body barely holding together after the battle. The Knights of the White Wolf, their numbers severely thinned, formed a loose line behind him, their warhammers held weakly, their bodies slumped from exhaustion, but their resolve unshaken. Even with Khorgar dead, even with his head rotting in the dirt, there was no peace yet. The dead still remained, and they were not leaving. Reinhardt tensed, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his blade, his teeth grinding against each other. "They aren't stopping," one of the remaining knights muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Another, his armor drenched in the viscera of slain beastmen, whispered, Perhaps they serve another master now. No, Reinhardt's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. He could see it now. The spectral warriors weren't waiting for orders. They weren't choosing their next enemy. They were fading. Slowly, like embers smothered by an unseen wind, their burning green eyes dimmed, their blades dropping to their sides, their forms wavering as though caught in an unseen current. And then, the first began to unravel. A knight in blackened ancient armor, its sigil long since worn away, lifted its blade one final time, its helmet tilting toward the sky as though it were looking toward a place it had long forgotten. Then its form split apart, its essence spiraling into ribbons of shadow, its armor collapsing into dust before it could even hit the ground. The others followed. One by one, the Legion of the Dead was torn away from reality, their forms flickering, their souls pulled into the abyss that had once held them prisoner. Some vanished instantly, dissolving like smoke caught in a storm. Others fought against it, their blades swinging wildly at the air, their screams lost in the void as their bodies were dragged into nothingness. One wraith, a towering figure in shattered plate armor, its body riddled with wounds from wars fought centuries before, turned toward Reinhardt, its flaming eyes locking onto him, as if memorizing his face, as if cursing him for breaking the chains that had bound it. And then it was gone. The air rushed inward, the very space where they had once stood collapsing upon itself, leaving behind nothing but silence and cold. The spectral army was no more. But their whispers lingered, and for the first time Reinhardt wondered if they had ever truly been the enemy at all. The price of their passing. The moment the last of the spectral warriors vanished, something shifted. The unnatural storm above Blackfang Rock began to wither, its howling winds settling, its tainted clouds dissolving into the morning light. The ruins of the fortress groaned, its corrupted stone cracking apart, collapsing slowly, like the husk of a dead beast left to rot beneath the sun. What had once been a throne of horrors, a breeding ground for something beyond mortal comprehension, was now nothing more than rubble and dust. The last remnants of the warband lay broken, their bodies strewn across the battlefield, their weapons rotting in their hands. The war was over, and yet, as Reinhardt watched the last embers of spectral fire flicker into darkness, he felt no victory, only an uneasy silence, a sense that something had been set right, but at a cost he could never fully understand. The artifact was gone. The horrors it had summoned were sealed once more. But the world had felt its touch, and it would never be the same. The weight of the past. Reinhardt exhaled slowly, his breath forming clouds in the morning chill, his fingers loosening from the hilt of his sword, as though releasing a burden he had carried for far too long. The surviving knights gathered behind him, their faces pale, their eyes haunted, but they were alive. That was enough. For now. Grandmaster Wolfram von Hellborg, his face lined with exhaustion, his hammer hanging limp at his side, stepped beside Reinhardt. "It's over," his voice was flat. Reinhardt nodded, but his mind lingered on the last of the wraiths, on the way its burning eyes had locked onto him, as if it had known something he did not. He turned toward Wolfram, his voice a whisper beneath the morning wind. No, his eyes remained fixed on the ruins of Blackfang Rock, on the ashes where something terrible had once stood, something that had nearly unraveled the world. It's never over, and though the wind was silent now, though the last of the dead had vanished into the void, the weight of the battle, of the war, of the things they had fought to put down, still lingered, and the Drakwald, once cursed, once defiled, would never forget what had happened here. Neither would he. And somewhere beneath the crumbling remains of Blackfang Rock, where no man or beast dared to tread, a whisper remained, fainted, distant, but waiting. Chapter 29. the ashes of Drakwald. The smoke rose thick and black, curling toward the pale morning sky like the dying breath of a slain god. The battlefield was silent now, save for the crackling of fire and the distant groans of the wounded. Blackfang Rock, once a monument to savagery and ruin, now lay in shattered ruin. Its stone broken, its halls collapsed, its cursed banners nothing but smoldering rags beneath the boots of the victors. But there was no triumph here, only ashes, and the work was not yet finished, cleansing the cursed ground. The survivors, Middenland soldiers, battered mercenaries, the last of the Knights of the White Wolf, moved like ghosts through the ruins, their faces ashen, their hands slick with blood, their bodies bent under the weight of what they had witnessed. There had been no true victory. There had been no spoils of war. There was only the task that remained. Reinhard von Drexler stood at the heart of the wasteland, his armor cracked and smeared with filth, his sword nothing but a jagged ruin at his side. His green eyes, once sharp and burning with righteous fury, were now hollowed with exhaustion, but his purpose remained. Burn it all. His voice carried over the field of the dead, over the rows of broken bodies, over the remnants of the Warherd, their twisted corpses piled in grotesque heaps. Every beastman, every knight, everything that fell in this place. Burn it. No one argued. No one hesitated. Torches were lit, oil poured, and soon the bodies began to burn, their flesh crackling, their bones snapping like dry twigs, the air thick with the stench of charred meat and old blood. Even the fallen knights, their silvered armor still gleaming beneath the filth, were given to the flames, their bodies too tainted, too ruined by the war to be granted a burial beneath the earth. The fire did not discriminate. It consumed all. And still Reinhard did not look away. Because this was necessary. Because if they left anything behind, if they allowed even a trace of Khorgar Bloodhorn's corruption to linger, then all of this would have been for nothing. Collapsing the caverns. Even as the bodies burned, the final task remained. The caverns beneath Blackfang Rock, the twisting tunnels that had once hidden the artifact, that had housed the relic's corruption, that had birthed the horrors that nearly consumed the world, still existed. And that could not be allowed. Bring the powder. The sappers, men of the Free Company, still clutching their blackened matchlocks, their armor dented and broken, nodded grimly, dragging barrels of black powder toward the cave mouths, their movements slow and methodical, their expressions grim and empty. It was a crude task, but one that had to be done right. The tunnels were vast, winding deep into the mountain, their depths soaked in wyrdstone radiation, their walls thick with the taint of something that had long since defied the gods and mortals alike. If even one passage remained open, if even one chamber was left untouched, then the world would never be safe. The charges were set, the powder placed, and with a single order, the first fuse was lit. A low hiss, followed by a spark of red flame, and then the earth trembled. The first blast rippled through the caverns, sending a shuddering shockwave through the already broken mountain. The ground split, rocks tumbling inward as the entrance to the underworld collapsed upon itself, sealing away whatever horrors had once been born within. Another detonation followed, and another, until finally there was nothing left but rubble and smoke. The path to the artifact was no more. Whatever lay beneath Blackfang Rock, whatever traces of its influence still festered in the shadows, would never see the light of day again. And yet, as the dust settled, as the last of the caverns were swallowed by the weight of stone and time, Reinhard felt something linger in the air, the presence, not of chaos, not of a god undone, but of something watching, waiting, even as the last of the ruins were buried, even as the fires continued to rage, even as the warriors left the battlefield behind. The Drakwald did not forget. It had seen what had happened here. He had felt the artifact's touch, and though the war was over, something remained, something beneath the earth, beneath the cursed winds of the forest, beneath the weight of memory itself. And one day, when the world had grown weak again, when the men of the Empire had forgotten the horror of this place, the Drakwald would remember, and it would call out once more, waiting for another fool to listen. Chapter 30. The Whisper Remains. The Drakwald was silent. The fires still smoldered, their blackened smoke curling through the morning air, mixing with the stench of charred flesh and rotting blood. The ground was slick with the remnants of war, a canvas of twisted metal, broken bodies, and the fading memories of something unnatural. But the world had not yet forgotten, because something still lingered. Beneath the ruins of Blackfang Rock, beneath the crushed bones of beastman and knight alike, beneath the ashen remains of the burned Warherd, it still waited. It had no form now, no voice, no master, but it remembered, and in time it would be found again. The hooded stranger. The morning mist curled through the ruins, thick and unnatural, clinging to the shattered stones like something living, something hungry. And through it, a lone figure walked, drifting between the corpses, between the cracked sigils of Middenland, between the flayed remnants of Khorgar's broken empire. The stranger moved with purpose, yet without sound. They were cloaked in black, their face obscured beneath the weight of a deep hood, their boots untouched by the blood-stained earth, their presence barely noticed by the last weary soldiers who scavenged through the wreckage. The survivors were too tired to care, too numb to the horrors they had seen. And so, no one noticed as the stranger reached the heart of the ruins. No one saw as they knelt in the rubble, their fingers brushing against the cracked stone where the artifact had shattered. And no one heard the whisper, the shod of the Forsaken. Beneath a layer of soot and ash, beneath the broken remains of Khorgar Bloodhorn, something glowed. Faint, weak, but alive. A single shard of wyrdstone, no larger than a man's thumb, still pulsed with the dying heartbeat of the artifact's once unimaginable power. It had been thought destroyed, scattered, lost, but power like this does not die so easily. The stranger reached out, their gloved fingers closing around the shard, lifting it into the morning light, watching as it flickered with something unnatural, something that should never have been allowed to exist. And as they held it, as the last vestiges of its corruptive essence slithered through their grip, a whisper crawled into their mind like a dagger of ice. It is not over. The stranger did not flinch, did not hesitate. Instead, they pulled the shard beneath their cloak, sealing it away, hiding it from the world once more. Then, without a word, they turned, stepping away from the battlefield, vanishing into the forest shadows, their path unclear, their purpose unknown. But the truth was simple. The war was over, but the story was not. Because in the end, power does not disappear. It only waits for the right time, for the right hand, for the rightful to seek it out once more. And in the cursed depths of the Drakwald, as the sun finally rose over the ruins of Blackfang Rock, the whisper remained.